In my previous video, I considered the question of whether or not an old Democrat can actually win the White House, given that so many of them, since Harry Truman, have actually been young political newcomers compared to the very older established politicians who have a habit of, well, losing the election. But the US system is very peculiar, as the Electoral College allows for candidates to actually lose the popular vote and still win the election. So with that, the question is, what happens if we were to look at the popular vote? Well, this idea comes from a YouTube comment from Colin Chen, who said, "Thanks for the video. Would love to revisit with popular vote rather than actual election result." And yes, we can do that. But what we have to do is take another look at the data. Last time we ran into a complication, that complication being that candidates compete in more than one election, and thus we have strong correlations between the outcomes of elections. To account for that, we used a tool called the Generalized Estimating Equation, and we're going to do that again for our slightly modified popular vote dataset. So let's go look at that. So we're going to consider the same dataset from the previous video, but we're going to make two modifications. We're going to take Al Gore and Hillary Clinton and move them from a 0, being a loss, up to a 1, being a win, because both of those candidates actually received more votes than their Republican challenger, even though they lost the election. So refitting the GEE model to our new data set, what do we find? We find absolutely no age effect whatsoever on the outcome. This is in contrast to last time, where we did notice that there was a significant age effect, even if it wasn't very good at predicting the outcome of the election. So why might that be the case? Well, here it actually really comes down to the candidate Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton is the oldest, at this moment, the oldest Democrat to ever run for the White House. So what that means is that she is actually something that we would call a leverage point. Because her age is much higher than the other candidates, and she is shifted very far to the right in our plot, what that means is that if we change the value that we assign to her from a 0 to a 1, that will have a very strong effect on the fitted model. This is in contrast to Al Gore. Because his age is very much average for our candidates, it's in the middle of our line. If we move his data point from a 0 to a 1, we don't actually get a strong change in our model. But again, our old model was very concerned with the idea that as you get older, you have a much less chance of winning the White House. When we move Hillary Clinton from the 0 to the 1 category, then we see absolutely no effect at all, because her point, again, is influencing where the fitted line is going. However, we could look at this data a little differently. We could throw out the 0s and 1s, the binary response, and instead we could consider the actual percentage of the popular vote gained. That means our response variable will now have a real value, or a value between 0 and 1, a fraction of the vote. And when we do that, we can still use a generalized estimating equation to try to fit a model to this data. So let's see what happens when we do that. When fitting a model to this data, we find no significant effect on the popular vote given the candidate's age. So what that means is no matter if a candidate is old or young, there doesn't seem to be any effect on the actual popular vote that candidate receives. But we can actually go further than that. The fitted line is flat. It is actually very flat, to the point that it's actually surprisingly unsurprising, or significantly insignificant. So what does that mean? Well, to think about that, why don't we consider some coin flips? If I were to take a coin and wanted to determine whether or not it was biased or fair, I could flip it many times and count the number of heads and tails. So let's say I took a coin and I actually flipped it 1,000 times. Now, on average, I would expect there to be 500 heads and 500 tails. So if instead I saw say 100 heads and 900 tails, then I could conclude that that coin is very much biased towards tails. But what would happen if I flipped that coin 1,000 times and had exactly 500 heads and exactly 500 tails? Well, that itself is actually quite surprising. That would only happen about 2.5% of the time. So if I were to see that, it would almost be too flat or too perfect. And that itself can sometimes be a little bit surprising. For our Democrats' performance, what we see is that it's an extremely flat line. There's really no slope up or down for the candidate's age. And what that means is that regardless of the candidate's age, there is no effect on the popular vote that we can detect based on our data set. So in conclusion, we see zero relation between a Democratic candidate's age and whether or not he or she wins the popular vote, or even the percentage of popular vote gained by that candidate. What that means is that Biden's extreme old age with respect to all the other candidates who have come in the past should neither hurt nor help him with respect to winning the popular vote, for whatever it's worth winning the popular vote in the US. But if we actually wanted to detect which factors do affect the popular vote gained by a given candidate, we'd have to once again look at the data.